Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Today we welcome investigative journalist and historian Gareth Porter back to the show to discuss the permanent war complex and how it developed in stages to the point where we now have defense and intelligence mega-contractors helping to drive and operate perpetual wars around the globe. Eisenhower's nightmare has come true. We also talk about recent machinations in the case of Julian Assange and Wikileaks. Gareth Porter specializes in covering issues related to U.S. wars and interventions. He's the winner of the 2012 Gellhorn Prize for Journalism. He's covered U.S. policy toward Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, and Syria for Interpress Service from 2004 to 14, and his stories were widely republished in other news sites. Since then, he's published stories and columns at Truthdig, American Conservative, Foreign Policy, Consortium News, Truthout, Antiwar.com, The Nation, and Middle East Eye. He's the author of 5 books, including 3 books on Vietnam and the U.S. war in Indochina. His latest book, Manufactured Crisis, The Untold Story of the Iran Nuclear Scare, reveals the true story of the Iran nuclear issue. It's been hidden and distorted by government propaganda and complete lack of media scrutiny. We recorded this interview on December 4th, 2018. Hello, Gareth. It's great to talk with you again. Welcome to Around the Empire.
Hello again, Joanne. Good to be on your show.
Hey, so I wanted to talk to you today about 2 topics, one primary topic and then a little bit about Julian Assange at the end. But our main topic today is the subject of one of your recent articles, a long article called The Permanent War Complex. And frankly, I think this is a subject that can't be analyzed or talked about too much because, especially when we read your article, it helps us find answers to some of the sort of inexplicable situations that we're in today. Most prominently are permanent wars, our endless, perpetual wars that no longer, or in most cases, in my view, don't serve the interests of the American public or the rest of the world, frankly, but, especially the people who are paying for it. So we're going to do a sort of a deep dive into this today. And just to start out, I like the way you broke this down into phases as to how the permanent war complex, two of the things I particularly liked about this article is how you broke it down into stages, and also that you put a lot of emphasis on, it's not just the arms, it's in this world of, this changing war, the intelligence complex is maybe just as big, and sometimes I think it's even more powerful than the arms industry. So where do you want to start here?
Well, thanks, Joanne. I mean, I couldn't agree more that this is a topic that really commands our attention. We can't pay enough attention to it. And I really believe that we are on the cusp of a period of political, maybe upheaval is too strong, but I'm not sure it is, in which the subject of not just the military-industrial complex as it has been known in the past, over the past decades, but what I'm calling the permanent war complex is going to be up for much more serious scrutiny and pressure from the American public. So I think I'm hoping that this will be at least a small contribution to the process of what I'm talking about here, that real fundamental reconsideration and development of strong citizen pressure to change fundamentally the system that we have really suffered under, as you've suggested in your intro. So I thought I would start the discussion by sort of going back to the earlier phase of understanding of the military-industrial complex and where it came from, and how that fits into American political and intellectual life in general. This is really a subject that the left, whether it's Marxist or non-Marxist, I mean, always influenced by sort of Marxian analysis in the United States, has always viewed as having economic class implications or origins. That is to say, the use of force by the United States and the buildup of arms and the buildup of the power of the Pentagon have traditionally been viewed by the left as a function of the economic interests of the capitalist system, the capitalist class, and particularly finance capitalism. And I have to say that personally, when I was younger, as a graduate student at the University of Chicago studying international politics, I tended to have a different view. I was attracted much more to a view that emphasized the bureaucratic interests of the Pentagon and the military services themselves. And this became something that was particularly strong in my own mind as I wrote my book on why and how the United States went to war in Vietnam. What that showed me was that the Pentagon as a bureaucratic political entity and the military services themselves were all in for that war from the beginning. I mean, that war was a product of pressure from the military and the Pentagon.
Can I just ask one question here?
Yes.
I've read that LBJ, when it was clearly obvious that the Vietnam War had to be ended, he answered a question of one of his close advisors as to why he wasn't doing it. And he said, "I can't because my friends are making too much money." Is that true?
I have not seen that quote. It's not unbelievable by any means. And so it's quite possible that that's perfectly accurate. But I didn't see that. I hadn't seen that. But in my book, I show that LBJ did not want to go to war in Vietnam. He was quite strongly personally opposed to it. And I document that view from the time that he was vice president. He was quite clear: the United States should not send combat forces to Vietnam, to South Vietnam. And LBJ, like JFK, were put under extremely strong pressure by their advisors, both military and civilian, including the CIA, including the National Security Council. And in fact, under LBJ, it was Robert S. McNamara, Secretary of Defense, and George Bundy, who was the holdover national security advisor in the early period of the Vietnam War, who were pressing him to begin the bombing of North Vietnam. And so, this was a very powerful case study for me to underline and reinforce the view that the problem of the war state, the problem of the military-industrial complex, is to a great extent the bureaucratic interests of those entities. And that's not to say that the arms contractors are not an important force. I wasn't suggesting that, but I wanted to readjust the emphasis on the two sides of the equation. Now, when I have begun to look into what's happened in the military-industrial congressional complex, as Eisenhower wanted to originally call it, but publicly did not use that complete phrase, to show what's actually happened in this article, I reviewed the entire history of changes that have taken place, particularly since the late 1980s. And what I was able to show in this article is that there is a very powerful shift toward privatization in the Pentagon, in the military, that has reshaped the nature, the political nature of the Department of Defense and the entire military-industrial congressional complex, because what has happened is that the arms contractors and, as you've suggested, also the intelligence contractors have been able to put their people into the Pentagon, the CIA, and the National Security Agency, and in the thousands, in many tens of thousands of people, when you add them all up, in the national security complex of the United States, are in fact employees of contractors. And that has made a huge difference in the way those institutions operate, because what it means is that contractors are actually making decisions that influence very powerfully the direction that the CIA and the Pentagon and the National Security Agency have gone.
And they're fully integrated now, as far as I know. I mean, I've been told that government employees have to make a choice. You know, there are people sitting right next to them doing the same job, but they're privatized. They're contractors and making, some multiple of their salary.
That's right. 2 to 3 times more is made by a contractor in the same job that was once done by a civil servant at 1/3 to 2/3 of the salary that's now being made by the contractor. So this is a very big change, and it's not supposed to happen legally. The law requires that these positions not be filled by private contractors.
Basically, U.S. law, corporate law, says that corporations and their employees, their first allegiance is to the shareholders, right? And the government employees, they've sworn an oath to the Constitution.
Absolutely. So this sets up a conflict of interest throughout these agencies that, no question, it has very strongly influenced the direction they've gone. And I have a quote in my article, which I think really, in a way, sums up the way in which the Pentagon has been changed fundamentally over these last couple of decades, last 2 to 3 decades. It's a quote from a senior military officer who served in Afghanistan and who was, who was interviewed by 2 Washington Post reporters for their book on the secret state, published in 2010. That's William Arkin and I've forgotten the name of the female reporter. I apologize. It just hasn't come back to me. But this senior officer said to them, it hits you between the eyes when you think about it. The Pentagon is no longer a war-fighting organization. It's a business. Now, that's a way of looking at it that is very dramatic, but I think it does, in a way, bring to the fore a reality that simply has not sunk in terms of the political system, particularly the political elites of this country, who are very assiduously avoiding that subject, that implication of the changes that have taken place. So that really is the first phase of fundamental change that I have tried to document in my piece, which took place from the late 1980s through the first decade of this century. And it's another way of dramatizing it, that change is that Robert M. Gates, who was also interviewed by the Post reporters, admitted that the privatization had taken place so fast. The private contractors had been introduced into the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which is the civilian side of the Pentagon, at such a rapid rate that he had no idea how many there were working under him at the Pentagon on the civilian side. So that's simply a dramatic illustration of how fast and how dramatically this changed the Pentagon. So The second phase that I go into then is the beginning of the permanent war, the state of permanent war by the United States. And so just to complete the thought that we began with here, what has taken place in my own understanding is that although it was true before World War II that the Pentagon didn't exist, but the US military was an instrument of finance capitalism and big corporations. And when they intervened in Latin America in particular, it was very clearly, it's well documented, that it was for the interests of the United Fruit and other corporations who were operating there. And Smedley Butler, who was a commanding officer in Nicaragua, as I recall, has written a short book, which everyone, perhaps, if they haven't read it, should read, that shows exactly how that worked. But what I had been impressed by was that after World War II, during the early stages of the Cold War, the Pentagon and the armed services took on their own independent bureaucratic interests. But now what we have is a fundamental shift here in which I think the private interests of the contractors have become at least equal in importance, if not beginning to overshadow the interests of the bureaucracies themselves. And I think that's really well worth further analysis and something that I will continue to work on. So that's by way of an introduction to that piece.
So a statistic that you give in this article, the 3- and 4-star generals who take jobs for defense contractors after they retire from the military, in 1993, 45% of them did, which is that's a huge number to start with. But as of 2005, it was up to 80%. So now we're getting to, a critical mass. And 2005, so that's now, do we have any numbers since then? Like, has it grown or?
I have tried to find anything comparable by way of statistics, and I have not been able to do that yet. But I'm working on it, and I hope to be able to fill in that blank before too long. Yeah.
Well, since I tend to seek out, I look for retired military people who I think are speaking truthfully about the subject, I notice that there aren't very many. There are not very many, and the case might not be that that's because they're all taking contracts or directly working for the military industrial complex, but at the very least, they're not willing to speak out in ways that they wouldn't be that complex wouldn't be happy with. So I would suspect that the trend has continued and has grown.
It has continued. There's no doubt about it. And just by way of reacting to your last comment, there's no question that the reality is that the vast majority of retired officers, certainly at the level of general, they are overwhelmingly, and I'm sure it's risen above 80% now over the last decade or so. They're overwhelmingly at the trough, if you will, and therefore simply never going to utter a word of critical character about the policies that are being carried out by the military and the Pentagon. And that's I think that's been shown many times, but some honest generals or colonels, lieutenant colonels have observed themselves personally that it's very difficult to find anybody, at higher levels, at senior levels of the military who are really independent, who are able to comment independently on any of these issues.
I think since ancient times, there have always been war profiteers, but we seem to have gone over the top with it. We've taken it to a whole different level where it's a fully integrated public-private institution now. And this privatization, I didn't really start to notice it until the Iraq War, when, contractors took over whole functions that our military in the Vietnam War did themselves.
Right.
So you mentioned that the privatization began before the end of the Cold War, and I can easily understand that. But where it really exploded was under H.W. Bush and the Clintons in the 1990s.
Right.
It wasn't really noticeable to me then, probably because that was just a point in time when I wasn't fully aware or paying attention or didn't have the sources that I was still listening to NPR and the BBC
Right.
all the time. But so it exploded then in the 90s, or is that where is that where they broke the ice? Is that where they where that change fundamentally happened and it just ran out of control from there?
Yes, it was accelerated enormously during the 1990s. That's right. And then, as you said, George H.W. Bush continued that, and if anything, there was an further acceleration during the Bush period.
I mean, these aren't just privateers, right? They are part of the war machine. They're at this point driving. I mean, they're. It seems to me they're integrated in every single part of the process. And you note that the drone war sort of transformed. It created another transformation because the process. You say, "quote the process of integrating drone contractors into the kill chain in multiple countries, thus marked a new stage in the process of privatizing war in what had become a permanent war complex." Now, when we think about the kill chain and the drone war process, the Obama administration painted a picture of, every Tuesday, well, first of all, some analysts coming up with a matrix of people using the mass surveillance machine, and then, that sort of would filter up to the top, and the top level people would make decisions and they would decide who to kill. And then the Air Force pilots in their remote stations would track down and, actually fire missiles at these targets.
Right.
But that's sort of a picture of a fully government process. Since the various companies that you mentioned, they're practically running the drone war, are they not?
Well, I don't know if you can say running the drone war, but they are, as the quote that you just read indicates, fully integrated into it and play an absolutely necessary role in the carrying out of the drone war. And I would just emphasize the point that what you described coming from the Obama administration's own description of how the drone war works is simply not an accurate description of the entire drone war. In fact, it represents only a small proportion of the actual decisions that were being made to fire weapons at individuals or at groups. That was really a description of how the Obama administration went about making decisions about targeting individuals, high-value targets. But in fact, obviously, most of the people being killed by drones, it's happening in war situations where decisions are made on the spur of the moment based on constant video surveillance of various sites, and a very large group of people who are involved in following the video images and making decisions about whether there is a target there to be hit. And that is where I think the biggest, well, obviously that's where most of the people who are killed in the drone war, where the killing is taking place. And Afghanistan is where more people are being killed, have been killed in the drone war than anywhere else. That's not generally understood. That's not very well known. It hasn't been well covered in the media, but that is the case. And what I show in my article is that by 2016, in fact, most of the bombs that were dropped in Afghanistan were being dropped or fired, as is more accurate terminology, by drones. And so the drone war had, in effect, taken over the primary role of remote killing in Afghanistan, the biggest war the United States has been fighting over the last decade. And this is a fact that really commands our attention and really requires, I think, citizens being educated and doing something about it.
You mentioned that not only do the arms manufacturers make the drones, they now also, in the name of a shortage of drone pilots, the contractors were ready to dive right in and do that work too on a service contract where they actually fly the drones, and they partner with the Air Force who stands there. And when it's time to actually fire the missile, you know, an Air Force officer or Air Force soldier presses the button to fire the missile. And it's even gone past that to the point now where one of the companies actually leases the drones to the Air Force, and so all the Air Force does is operates them technically, almost nominally, it seems.
Yeah, involvement by the drone contractors, which really merit our attention. One, as you said, is that when the drone war really heated up very rapidly in Afghanistan, again, this is what has been driving a great deal of the development of the change in the drone war. The private contractors, not just the contractor, General Atomic is the one that produced the Reaper, which is the main drone that has been used in the drone war or drone wars in various countries. The General Atomics was the one that created the Reaper, and that they have been involved in it. But other drone makers and contractors were asked to fill in the needed positions that were necessary for looking at the video screen to follow the images that were collected by the drones high in the sky of sites that the military wanted to be covered, so that they could figure out if they had a target to be hit by the drones. And they did not have the military personnel necessary with the training, with the expertise necessary to carry out that function. So they called on these various contractors who had experience with drones to carry out those functions. As you say, the final decision to drop or to fire the weapon was still made by the military, or the CIA in some cases, as I understand it. But mostly it was the Air Force. And then you had another case where General Atomics was asked to basically lease their entire their whole setup that was prepared for carrying out the drone war to the military, and as well as to provide the services. And so, they were drafted into the process in that way. And finally, General Atomics has actually been flying the drones, quote unquote, meaning that they are the ones who are navigating the drone while the people who are the analysts are trying to decide when they have a target, whether they have a target. Now, once again, General Atomics is not making the decision to fire, but they are the ones who are at the console at the time that this process is going forward, making the decision to fire the weapon. General Atomics and other drone contractors involved in everything except for the final decision to fire the weapon.
So again, with Afghanistan, you mentioned that in the first quarter of 2016, the Air Force data showed 61% of the weapons dropped in Afghanistan were from drones.
Right.
That was larger than I thought it would be. But I also have to wonder, and I have wondered this many times, you have these weaker countries. Um, Gareth, it looks to me like the drone wars are not just about fighting a war, that they are, training, practicing, testing weapons, and in my view, maybe marketing the drone weapons. I don't know. I just can't do. Have you ever gotten that sense?
I have not looked into the role of the Pentagon in marketing drone technologies, but I would tend to think that that is not generally the practice. I'd have to go further into it, but I don't recall seeing anything specifically about the Pentagon trying to sell drones. I think private contractors themselves are doing it, and that is the equivalent of, I think that's the reality that replaces the Pentagon trying to sell market drones to foreign governments. But there's no doubt the marketing is going on at a very furious pace, and these drone contractors are increasing their profits from selling their drones abroad. There's no question about that.
And then how about the connections between the major contractors? Do you get are there have to be rivalries and competition, right? Because these are for-profit companies. Do they compete with each other, or is there a cartel of sorts? And if they do compete with each other, what's the impact on war decisions and just the overall situation if we have really powerful companies?
Joanne, I think you have both competition and cooperation, or a group of contractors working together on a particular project. You have competition at the very early stage of development of a particular type of weapon, including drones. But at the point that the Pentagon chooses the model or the particular drone project, the contractor that has the drone project that they favor, then generally speaking, you have a new situation where either the contractor, has cooperation with other contractors where it has subcontracts that other contractors participate in, or as in the case of General Atomic, I think General Atomics, they basically have it pretty much to themselves because they did develop this on their own. It's a very unusual case where there was no need for them to have other contractors come in as joining them as subcontractors in the entire process of producing the weapon system. So in other cases, I think, for example, the Global Hawk, which was one that involved subcontractors, was a more complex system, perhaps a bigger system. You do have some cooperation among contractors. And by the way, the Global Hawk is the case which I highlight in my article. This was a large drone that was to be used for long-range reconnaissance. In other words, intelligence, basically photography of large areas of territory that the Pentagon might want to be covered for the purpose of scouting out targets, or simply, to see what's happening in terms of war situation or potential war situation. But what the Pentagon found out from testing the Global Hawk was that it was not as good as the old U-2, which had been around for so many decades. People thought it was certainly time to retire it. But it turned out the Global Hawk was so weak and so unreliable because so many parts didn't work that they were ready. The Pentagon wanted to scrap it. They basically wanted to stop buying it And this is where we come into a new phenomenon, or maybe it's not new, but a new version of the phenomenon of the contractors having enough power to prevent the Pentagon from making a decision to stop buying a particular weapon system, in this case, the drone. Because what happened was that the contractors got together who had a role in the Global Hawk and bought off the key members of Congress and the Armed Services Committee, as well as the military subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee. And they got all those people to support continuation of the original purchase order of the Pentagon. So the Pentagon was unable to make a decision to stop the procurement of this system. And to my mind, that's a harbinger of potential future problems in trying to turn off the whole drone war.
Not
Yeah.
only a harbinger of, the inability to stop the drone war. I mean, the bigger picture is that it's a level of corruption. I believe that corruption leads to incompetence because basically decisions are not made based on any kind of merit. And I mean, what you just described there should be a showstopper. The Pentagon was saying these are ineffective, and the arms manufacturers overrode them for the inferior product. Therefore,
Exactly.
that leads to vulnerabilities on our part that could be exploited by our adversaries. I think it probably is. We're starting to see some competition in the planes, tanks, weapons, everything from the Russians and the Chinese. And in my view, some big gaps in the effectiveness of, let's say, missile systems, or missile defense systems, and maybe vulnerabilities exploited. And basically, the people who make these weapons are saying, we don't care. This is a cash cow for us, and we're going to keep going with it, even if it's the inferior product. I mean, you're just undermining the effectiveness of the entire military and national security, are you not?
I would agree that certainly it's a theoretical possibility that the phenomenon we're just talking about here could result in a bad weapon system that could be problematic if the United States ever went to war. However, I have to say that far more, many times more important in the certainly the reality that we have faced for decades and still face today is that the result of this is that the Pentagon continues to purchase weapons that are completely unnecessary and are really not in the interests of the United States for that reason, more than the result that we get in inferior weapons. That can happen, I agree, but I think far more important is that it causes the United States to continue to purchase weapons that it doesn't need, and in this case, and I think perhaps more important than anything else, it raises the possibility and indeed the likelihood that the United States will continue to use weapons in war that it shouldn't be using. That war should not be continuing, and this is a phenomenon that I'm sorry to say puts the United States government in the position of risking the continuation of wars that never should have started in the first place. I mean, these drone wars are not in the interest of the United States, never have been. And I talk in my article about the evidence that has been gathered by even the most hawkish people like Petraeus and the other general who was replaced by Petraeus in Afghanistan. They both believed that the drone war was not in the interest of the United States because it generated more enemies than it killed, and
Right.
that has been the considered opinion of just about everybody who's really looked at that question closely or who knew what was going on in Pakistan Afghanistan and elsewhere. So I think that's really the danger that we're looking at with regard to the corruption, as you correctly put it, surrounding the procurement of weapons and of intelligence drones in this case.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that concept. I was sort of trying to frame it in their own language, in their own arguments, which yeah. So I just had another question for you before we switch over to just to talk a little bit about the situation with Julian Assange.
Right.
Of course, I always have 100 questions for you, but so here's a big question: can presidents end wars?
That's a very good question. Yes. I mean, obviously, legally they can. It's the constitutional duty of the president to make such determinations. And at the same time, the reality over the series of wars that we have seen the United States start during the Cold War and since, the reality has been that there are political and bureaucratic pressures on the president not to end wars. And I mean, this has become a real constitutional crisis for the United States. And that, I mean, there's just no other way to put it. Because if you look at, the series of wars that started with Vietnam, really the only ones that were ended definitively were Vietnam, because we lost and we had to pull our troops out, and the first Gulf War, which the United States won. It was kind of like shooting fish in a barrel. And the president did, in fact, make a decision, and we have to give George H.W. Bush credit for this. This is one of the things I would credit him with, for not having invaded Iraq, which was what Cheney and others at the time were insisting that he should do. In that case, Bush did, in fact, buck the tide of pressure for continuing that war, and in fact, escalating it. But all of the other wars that the United States has started, they have not been willing to end. I mean, the forces that wanted those wars to continue have been powerful enough to keep them going. And as I say, I regard this as a genuine constitutional crisis, because I think the president has been unable politically to do what he needs to do constitutionally and make the decision to end those wars.
Yeah. And that's, a pretty big deal. And I would say that one of the silver linings with Trump is that was more out in the open. So maybe that question will be more considered by regular Americans as they're pondering what's going on here. But another question I've always wondered about, the neoconservatives sort of faction under George Bush the second, Bush, is he 40? 43. They had an Office of Special Plans, and they were clearly determined. They were behind the drive to the invasion of Iraq.
Right.
Was there a particular, did they have connections to defense contractors, or what was driving them? Was it ideology, or did they have, particular contractors that they were involved with, or some other goal?
Very good question. And I mean, the answer is, according to people who have done the research, I've not done it myself, but I think it's quite credible that this is true. Researchers have said that virtually every one of the leading neoconservatives in the George W. Bush administration did, in fact, have ties in the past to Lockheed.
Yeah, I heard that too.
That included Vice President Dick Cheney's wife, who was on the board of directors of Lockheed twice for 8 years. Now, she wasn't making millions of dollars, but nevertheless, she got upwards of between $500,000 and $1 million over those 8 years. And so there was a tie-in between Cheney and Lockheed, and all the others who were part of the Cheney-Rumsfeld grouping of people who were pushing for the invasion of Iraq and who resisted any effort to turn that off at any time before Rumsfeld left the Pentagon, all had connections of one sort or another with Lockheed. So that's I think a very, very important piece of evidence that the ties between the advocacy for war and for policies which inevitably or at least are highly likely to risk new wars, the tie-in with the major arms contractors is very strong. There's no question in my mind about that.
And not talked about very much, as far as I know.
Not enough. Absolutely.
I have one more question before we go over to Assange. Who do you think is more powerful, the arms contractors or the intelligence contractors? And do you think there's been a trend?
Well, in a way, it's like comparing apples and oranges because they can both be equally, not necessarily, they are not necessarily equally powerful, but they could be equally powerful within their separate realms. And I think that it may be that the intelligence contractors are even more powerful within their realm than the arms contractors are within theirs. And the reason I say that is that there has been one case study in particular which appears to support that point of view. And that is when the NSA was choosing its system for updating and expanding its dealing with masses of intelligence data, and the internal group within the Pentagon, led by Bill Binney, had come up with a system called ThinThread, which was going to manage that problem very well without intruding into the privacy of the citizens of the United States. But the NSA made the decision to go with a system that was favored by its major contractor allies. And it was going to be worth on the order of $4 billion, whereas the internal system would only cost a few $100 million. So you see here at work the fundamental forces that were pushing the NSA in the direction of favoring its contractor allies in a fundamental policy decision that, of course, one can say without any doubt was a major factor in the failure to detect the 9/11 plot to blow up the Twin Towers and hit the Pentagon. Because ThinThread, by general agreement, would have allowed the CIA to have located the Al-Qaeda people who are in the United States and connect them with the plot, the other plotters outside the United States very quickly. And the probability is that the plot would have been prevented had it not been for that decision. So this is a spectacular case showing just how important and how powerful intelligence contractors had become by 2001, essentially, by 2000, essentially.
I had never thought of it framed that way. I know that story about ThinThread and how General Hayden basically shoved that project aside in favor of a much, much more expensive outsourced contractor project that ended up failing in the end.
It's well documented that was indeed the result of the decision that was made. That in fact, the Congressional Oversight Committee, as well as others within the NSA, came to the conclusion that the ThinThread system would have had that, given them that capability, and undoubtedly that would have been the result.
Anything else you want to wrap up with before we just talk a little bit about Assange?
To the best of my knowledge, we exhausted
it. So you have another article here. I believe this one's in Truth Dig. Right. And it is titled, "The UK and Ecuador Conspired to Deliver Julian Assange to U.S. Authorities." Just give us sort of a short summary of what you think is going on here.
Sure. Well, the title is a bit misleading because the burden of the article is that the Trump administration, essentially Mike Pompeo, the CIA director, I think is clearly the ringmaster in this regard, began to go after Assange to make it clear that they were going to track Assange down and get a hold of him in March of 2017. And this was because that was immediately after the CIA suffered its worst embarrassment, perhaps of all time, which was the WikiLeaks publication of tens of thousands of pages. I can't remember how many thousands of pages. Maybe it wasn't tens of thousands of pages of secret documents which were related to the so-called Vault 7 projects or Vault 7 technologies. Now, Vault 7 technologies were basically hacking tools that the CIA had developed over the previous years that they could use to hack into any electronic device anywhere in the world and basically take control of it and get whatever they wanted from it. And then they could make it look like another foreign intelligence agency had carried out the hack.
Yeah.
So that was an extremely embarrassing revelation that WikiLeaks carried out.
Particularly at that time during the hysteria of Russiagate.
Exactly. The timing was exquisitely bad from the point of view of the CIA, and of course from the point of view of the deep state generally. So Pompeo immediately came out and made it clear that the CIA was determined to punish Julian Assange, and that of course meant that the United States would work to get its ally, the UK, and the Ecuadorian government, who would be the key actors in this, because Assange has been in the Ecuadorian embassy in London since 2012, to get them to come to an agreement that would result in his losing his asylum status in the embassy. So that was the first indication of the Trump administration's commitment to this. And that continued then through 2017 and into 2018. And then in addition to what spurred this on was the election in 2017, in April 2017, of a new government in Ecuador led by Lenin Moreno, who is a center-right figure. He was parading, or masquerading, I guess is the correct term, as a leftist, as part of the left coalition that was supporting the previous incumbent, Rafael Correa. But as soon as he was elected, he immediately moved to the right and made it clear that he was breaking with basically all of the policies that had been pursued by his predecessor. And as part of that, he made it clear that his government wanted very much closer relations with the United States. And of course, relations between Ecuador and the United States had deteriorated rapidly, in under the Correa administration. And Correa had expelled 50 U.S. military personnel attached to the embassy, charging that they had become influences penetrating different sectors of Ecuadorian society. But in any case, the Moreno government was prepared to cooperate in the policy of the Trump administration, and this became apparent in late 2017, early 2018, or at least it wasn't apparent then, but we now understand that this was the case, that the Ecuadorian government was working with the UK to set up a situation which would allow them to strip Assange of his asylum status. And the way it was to take place very quickly, I'll try to summarize it quickly, is that they had the Ecuadorian government had a plan under which the government would give Assange diplomatic status and would give him diplomatic credentials, diplomatic passport, in return for his giving up his asylum status. And actually, they had made him an Ecuadorian citizen in December 2017 to begin the process. But the UK government then made it clear that the UK government would not recognize his diplomatic credentials. Now, I think there's still some ambiguity here about exactly what happened and what the exact calculus of the Ecuadorian government was in giving Assange diplomatic credentials. Nothing more was heard about that case. Nothing was made public about it until September 2018. And this is when The Guardian published this scurrilous article, which accused Assange basically of having negotiated through an Ecuadorian cutout, who was a close confidant of Assange's, a scheme under which he would be secreted out of the embassy into a diplomatic car and somehow gotten out of the UK altogether and would go to Russia. There was absolutely no evidence whatsoever that ever took place. And indeed, it's a stupid idea. It couldn't possibly work. And the whole story was clearly a fabrication. And we now know that it was co-written by an Ecuadorian journalist who has not a very good reputation and who was extremely close to the opposition to the Correa government in the past. I can't go into detail about that, but that is well documented. So that is evidence that at some point the UK and the Ecuadorian government were cooperating to basically try to link Assange with Russia, a linkage which is absolutely untrue. And I show in my article that former UK ambassador to Uzbekistan, who is a truth teller and who is very reliable on this, helped Assange to scout out possible locations of countries where he might go as a diplomat. And Russia was not among them. Indeed, Assange told him that he absolutely would not agree to go to Russia. He did not want to go there. So that is a key turning point in this story. And we know since then that the UK and Ecuador have been negotiating on a solution to this problem that would result in the stripping of Assange's asylum status, but we don't know exactly what their plan is at this point. And so that's the situation as I understand it.
Another case where Craig Murray comes in and offers firsthand information, and it just sort of gets ignored. Key parts of the story, and Robert Mueller doesn't interview him, and the press doesn't really pick up on that information, and it's just really stunning to watch this whole thing playing out. I think I've kept you too long, so if there's anything else that we want to mention before we wrap up.
Well, I would just add that the same people who wrote this fabrication about Assange supposedly cooperating in a plan that would or negotiating a plan that would end up with him in Russia, including Luke Harding, the guy who was known as one of the leading proponents of the most extreme Russiagate theories. He is also the co-author of this latest fabrication about Manafort going to see Assange 3 times in the Ecuadorian embassy, a story which now absolutely we know for sure is a fabrication, and the Guardian has egg all over its face over this. So the same people were involved in both of those fabrications.
Yeah, it looks like maybe this time Harding is taking it too far.
Yes,
I hope there's some accountability for it because, there hasn't been in the past. So,
indeed. That's the hope that we have to keep, even if it's there's not much chance of it, I'm afraid. But that's what we should hope for.
yeah, this one hasn't played out yet. Gareth, where can people find your work and how can they support you?
Well, that's a good question. I wish I had my website up and running, but I don't have it yet. Meantime, the main places where I've been publishing are Truth Out, Truth Dig, and the American Conservative. And by the way, just a little hats off to the American Conservative for publishing the article we were discussing earlier on the military industrial congressional complex becoming the permanent war complex. And this, I think, represents a very important development that it would have been good to discuss, but we can do that on another occasion.
Yeah, I know what you're getting at there, and there's a lot of great content, and you know, someone who's come up from the left like me, I find myself relying on them um,
Yes,
a lot more than it's just crazy stuff going on as far as this left-right thing.
indeed.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I hope to talk to you again sometime soon.
Thanks so much, Joanne. Glad to do it.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
And that's our show. Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Gareth Porter. Find Gareth's work at Truth Dig, American Conservative, Foreign Policy, Consortium News, Truth Out, Antiwar.com, The Nation, and the Middle East Eye. Look for his books, including his latest, Manufactured Crisis, The Untold Story of the Iran Nuclear Scare. And follow Gareth on Twitter at Gareth Porter. The Around the Empire podcast, independent media, brought to you with the help of our donors. You can pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or one-time donations on our website, aroundtheempire.com. Follow us on Twitter at aroundtheempire. Follow me at Joanne Leon, JoanneLeon. Please help out with our YouTube channel by subscribing. That's free. And give a thumbs up or a like to the individual videos. We're growing, but we still need more subscribers to qualify for revenue and Super Chat live streams that I'd like to get started in the new year. Also, subscribe to this podcast on your preferred podcast app. You can find it on most of them. Podcatcher apps like iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Music, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and others. Take a minute to leave a nice review. It helps with ranking and visibility. And we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.